So when we talk about measuring change, we talk about measuring against those intended outcomes, things that we set forth to do and in ways in which we imagined we'd create change. But there's also unintended outcomes, some of which can be really positive and some of which can be really negative, such as gentrification. So is there any advice that LISC gives or anything that LISC tracks to ensure that there are indeed positive outcomes happening as a result of these projects?
Yeah, definitely. So I think first, you know, LISC, we work in lower income neighborhoods, and the first thing that we really want to be explicit on is definitions and like what are we actually talking about when we talk about gentrification? Are we talking about displacement? Are we talking about physical displacement? Are we talking about cultural displacement? And driving to kind of an understanding of what are the root causes of the neighborhoods that we're working in today. So I think the first step when you are working in a lower income neighborhood is to really try to understand the root causes at play that created the neighborhoods that you're working in. And that means understanding the federal policies that existed that explicitly forbade lending to African American families, that subsidized suburbanization, but at the same time refused to lend in inner cities.
Structural racism that still reverberates and affects us today.
Right. Yeah, and so the legacy of those policies, as well as stuff that's going on today in terms of racialized mass incarceration, where you have neighborhoods where the majority of men in the neighborhoods have trouble getting a job because of a criminal background. And those structural issues and institutional issues are really still at play today in our neighborhoods. And so having that understanding is really important. I think the second thing is understanding that specific neighborhood's history. You know, why is it that a freeway really walls this neighborhood off from the rest of the city? And what has been happening kind of on the city level in terms of investment in the neighborhood or lack thereof as well. And I think in previous segments you all talked about asset mapping, and that's another important thing to do as you're working in a neighborhood. And then I think fourth is really kind of understanding your background and how you fit in, and understanding the potential privilege that you may be bringing into a setting, and acknowledging that up front. What we have found is really important is listening, the role that listening plays in building trust. Listening and showing up helps build trust. And that can't be really neglected. A lot of the work, the really good work that is done in our neighborhoods is hard. It takes time, and it's about the process more than the outcome at times as well. And so what we have seen kind of a really key things to be thinking about in terms of unintended consequences versus intended consequences is the role that building that trust plays, and the role that putting neighborhood residents in the driving seat plays. Unintended consequences definitely happen, but if residents have been there from the start, they understand. So driving to a point in your organization or your project where residents are either co-leading with you and co-creating with you as well. Because ultimately, there is already a neighborhood and an ecosystem in which you're going into. And that is really important to consider.
Is there anything that LISC is doing as a lender, as a supporter, as an intermediary to make sure that some of those negative effects aren't happening, and that these ways of operating that you're lifting up in terms of partnerships, in terms of listening, to make sure that those really are a strong part of the project?
Definitely, because it goes to the core of what we do. And so especially in kind of hot markets, which DC is one, is we evaluate projects based on their ability to provide space for lower income households, which there isn't much space provided for lower income households in a lot of market rate development that happens. So when we lend to create affordable opportunities for families that are working hard and keeping our city running, to lay their head down at night. We are lending to organizations that provide key and vital support systems, whether it's healthcare, whether it's access to healthy food, early childhood care, to our residents in our neighborhoods. We look to invest in those projects. So in a way, LISC is not just any type of lender. We are looking to fill gaps that exist in our society because of a lot of those structural issues that we talked about before, and we're looking to support the projects that really impact our neighborhood residents to the full extent.
So going back to measurement and now talking about gentrification, can you talk a little more then about measuring by housing values increase?
Yeah, and actually I was just having a conversation with our research director about this on the traditional way of measuring, one of the traditional ways of measuring community development. Does it actually apply anymore, or actually are we looking for property value stabilization instead of growth? And I mean, I think it gets at the fact that ultimately we live in a capitalistic society where every investment you make in a neighborhood that improves the quality of life in that neighborhood will likely be capitalized in home values. And that's not necessarily an inherently bad thing, because there are a lot of people that are living in the neighborhoods where we work that have been systematically shut out from wealth growth for generations. And I'm talking about predatory lending. I'm talking about being denied mortgages because of the color of your skin. And so I think that is why there has been a historic focus on property value and ownership in the community development world. But now, today, when we're seeing kind of a re-urbanization of major cities and the insane hot housing markets that go along with that, the field is really looking at creating places to preserve affordability and to create spaces where property value growth might be tamed a little bit. And one of the major tools that folks are turning to is a community land trust model, which creates affordable ownership opportunities for people. And so that means you're still getting ownership and you're still realizing at least some equity growth, but it keeps housing affordable in perpetuity for the longer term because of the model that the community land trust uses. And the one other thing that I would mention about kind of community land trusts, which have roots in the civil rights movement, is the community has a say over what happens as well. Over the board of a community land trust is actually made up of community residents, community land trust homeowners or renters, and then housing experts as well. So it is a model that provides ownership, affordable ownership for generations, and also provides a voice for residents to have a say over what happens in their neighborhood.
And how is that linked to something you mentioned earlier, which is cultural displacement?
Yeah, so one example that I think I can share, because I think folks are fairly familiar with the 11th Street Bridge Park and their equitable development work.
Yes.
We were very involved with the Bridge Park team in helping them design and manage that year-long equitable development planning process that resulted in community-driven and vetted recommendations in 3 areas: affordable housing, workforce development, and small business. the thing that we were missing in that conversation was arts and culture. And so we've actually been working with the Bridge Park to create a fourth leg to that chair that includes strategies in arts and culture to get at the fact that there is cultural displacement that occurs in neighborhoods that change rapidly, and we've seen that in our city. And the Bridge Park right now is working, has done a public planning process and has identified recommendations in arts and culture that they can be working towards as their project continues.
That's great. Is there anything else we can learn from that 11th Street Bridge Park project? Because I know there's a lot of players involved there, as you mentioned, housing and urban development. Anything else that you're studying or looking at in that particular investment?
Yeah, they actually, a lot of what we've touched on today is exemplified in the Bridge Park. The importance of building trust and listening and showing up. That is what the Bridge Park does, and they have been doing that for years. And instead of coming into a neighborhood and saying, here's an idea and we're going to do this, and just asking for approval, they first asked if this made any sense. And then once residents said, yeah, that makes sense, that would be nice, they said, okay, help us design this. And so they really drove to that co-leadership, co-creativeness that I think community projects that really represent a neighborhood voice do. The other thing is, and you touched on this earlier, was the partnerships. The issues, the structural issues that exist in our society today are going to require all of us working towards a collective goal. And the Bridge Park team has really exemplifies the importance of partnership and collective action.